good morning. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you on the screen. I would rather be in a meeting in person with you guys. But anyway, this is one of the consequences of the pandemic. Just a few initial remarks, and I would like to remember that this is the third iteration of the Turbulent Democracy and the International System conference. The first one we held 5 years ago, a few weeks after the Brexit, and just 5 months before Trump's victory in the US. Some of us who are here today were there at the foundation. I vividly remember Kori Schake. Hi, Kori. Thank you for making the time to be here with us today. And in those days, we were facing the first strong signals of a mounting tide of nationalistic right-wing populism in Europe and in the US. Well, to be more precise, in Europe, the signals have started before. In Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, in 2010, 2011. And in Europe, especially after the refugee crisis that took place in 2015, 1 year before our first conference in June 2016, that crisis triggered a wave of right-wing nationalism in Western Europe also. And in those days, we were very much afraid of a kind of maybe a domino effect stemming from the Brexit, right? And little did we know that in a few years, populist right-wing nationalism will gain traction in Brazil. And now we have Bolsonaro as president of the Republic. So in that first conference, I remember that in my initial remarks, I said one phrase, right, that I think express a sense of perplexity in face of the changes in the global sphere and in the main cradles of democracy around the world. And my phrase was, what the hell is going on, right? And I think now we know what the hell was going on. In my initial remarks, this time around, I would like to replace it with another phrase that expressed not so much perplexity, but uncertainty. And my question is, are we already out of the woods, right? In terms of threats to liberal democracy and threats to some form of multilateral cooperation in the global sphere. And I think we may disagree on that, to what extent we have come out of the woods. Certainly, we are not out of the woods entirely. And but one thing is for sure, there can be no return to the status quo ante. To quote the famous Dorothy phrase in The Wizard of Oz, we are not in Kansas anymore, right? So the purpose of this conference here is to try to charter this new territory and hopefully to illuminate some paths forward towards a more cooperative multilateral global order in which democratic nation states prevail over authoritarian ones. So without further ado, I would like to hand it to Elena, to Ian to say a few initial remarks. And last but not least, let me praise the partnership we have with GMF that started 5 years ago, and I'm sure we'll have a long and enduring future. Thank you so much, Ian, my friends at GMF. Ian, the floor is yours.
Sergio, thank you very, very much indeed. It's really good to be with you again. I mean, I think we all are a little sorry we're not with you again in Brazil. but soon, we hope. Anyway, and we'd love to have you in Brussels or Washington too, obviously. Just let me say, our thanks to you, because this is really a great partnership with the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation. We enjoy this very much, and I hope it's a hugely satisfying conversation for all of you who've joined. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I'm not going to say too much, Sergio, except to say I'm going to tell you my answer to your question of whether we're out of the woods yet, which is no. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. Maybe not even close to being out of the woods yet. I would say that's true from an American perspective. I think it's true if you look from Europe, and it's true. We'll be interested to hear what our Brazilian colleagues have to say. I think if you look at what's going on in on both sides of the Atlantic, but also in Brazil and also north and south in the Atlantic, you see lots of turbulence, as we say here. And, it may lead us to something more positive. It may not. We're going to discuss it over 2 days. I think, the other interesting point is that I think in some of our last conversations, we sort of took as a starting point the turbulence, the democratic turbulence, and tried to kind of project what that might mean for the international system. We're doing a bit of that again here, that kind of inside out thing, if I can say, but we're also doing a bit of the outside in, and trying to discuss what some of the big picture drivers in the international system may mean for the future of democracy in our own societies. I mean, both of those ways of looking at this question are valid, and I think we're going to get to both of those over the next 2 days. So many thanks again to you, Sergio, to your whole team and colleagues, and to everyone who's joined us. And I really look forward to the conversation. We have great people to lead us in that. And to moderate our first session, we're really delighted to have our friend Elena Lazarou with us. Elena is acting head of the External Policies Unit at the European Parliament Research Service. And Elena, thank you so much for doing this, and over to you.
Many thanks, Ian. I think I will be very unoriginal by saying that I'm also quite sad we're not having this in Brazil. I remember the last time I visited Brazil was actually for one of those, maybe not too long before COVID, and it definitely adds a flavor, but it also affects the way of thinking. So I hope we can all pretend we're in Brazil for the next couple of hours and think in this global south kind of way. The second thing is I should also mention that I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House's Latin American Initiative, not to blow my own horn, but because I see a number of my colleagues from Chatham House on the call, so I would feel bad not to mention it and they will tell me off. But really to start with the panel itself, and after thanking you for inviting me, this panel, the first panel, will take a more broad and international view. I think we're looking, as you said, at the outside here. But of course, it's become impossible to separate the outside from the inside. The internal, the external are more linked than before. The panel is named Key Drivers of the Redistribution of Geopolitical and Geoeconomic Power at the Global Level. I think that's as general as it can get in saying we're going to talk about everything that's important about geopolitics today. I think I see the group here. There's participants from the US, from Europe, from South America. And there's one thing I would say is that the key themes we've all been looking at in one way or another for the past couple of years are definitely the changing nature of power. And we've been looking at that for a decade, but COVID, the rising importance of technology, the realization of the importance of the resilience of supply chains and of trade for autonomy and for the ability to have the systemic model that a country would aim to have, systemic rivalry in the sense of China's rise and the US, and populism, disinformation, everything that has been mentioned is in this package. But the question this panel seeks to ask is, how does this redistribution of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and I would add geotechnological power affect democracy? What does it mean for the future of liberal democracy? And what does it mean for, I think, ultimately multilateralism and global governance in the way that it will be shaped? including by the US, the EU, and Latin America, which are part of this forum and have been for a while. Now, to discuss these questions, I am very honored to be moderating this panel because we have exceptional speakers, some of which I have had the pleasure to call colleagues in the past. We have with us Laura Thornton, who is Director and Senior Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. I think a key program for anyone who is studying disinformation and democracy these days. And Laura comes with a rich experience of working at International IDEA, also a flagship program when it comes to democracy and human rights, and several posts in Asia, which I think will come very much into the Asia experience into this discussion. Laura will be followed by Kori Schake, who's, I understand, Kori, you've been in this forum several times, but Kori is very well known to everyone here. She's a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She was previously Deputy Director General at IISS in London and has had a distinguished career at the US State Department, Department of Defense, National Security Council, and taught at many universities, including Stanford and Johns Hopkins. And last but not least, Oliver de la Costa Stuenkel, a good friend and associate professor at the School of International Relations at the Fundação Getulio Vargas in São Paulo, a non-resident scholar at Carnegie Endowment and at the GPPI in Berlin, and columnist. I think anyone who follows Latin America and Brazil follows Oliver. If not, please do. So without further ado, I will first turn to Laura to open up the discussion, thinking about all these big themes in geopolitics and democracy, and perhaps honing in as well, Laura, on your recent work on how COVID has affected democracy, human rights, and how that links up to geopolitics.
Thank you so much, Elena. And I will also reiterate my desire to be in Brazil, a place I have never been, which is so traumatizing. And I'm just very jealous of hearing about these previous events, which unfortunately I missed. So this is my first Turbulent Democracy event. And so thanks so much to GMF and FHCC for organizing it and including me in the Alliance for Securing Democracy. So as Elena said, I think it is a big subject, the future of democracy, emerging dynamics between powers. And I do think looking at crises is a useful lens. And so I have spent a lot of time over the last year plus looking at COVID-19's relationship with democratic function, but more importantly, its implications as a driver for change. So basically in the research I've done, both recently at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, but previously at International IDEA, I looked at sort of two main questions. First, what did the pandemic reveal about the quality and strength of liberal democracy as an effective governance structure, and how that contributed to shifting international dynamics and global narratives between democratic and authoritarian states? And then secondly, what were the actual impacts of COVID responses on democratic function and human rights? And what does that reveal about advancing liberal democracy and or rising authoritarianism going forward? So on the first one, I think that we've all seen with our own eyes that the pandemic has shone a rather bright light on the quality of the relationship between citizens and state, the social contract, effectiveness of governance to respond to crises. And so this led to numerous players trying to divide this as a democracy, non-democracy dichotomy and fueling narratives around the international struggle between authoritarian and democratic models for global governance. Though, of course, as we know, authoritarianism and democracy is more of a spectrum rather than these 2 points. So through our tracking at ASD on the Hamilton dashboard, we've seen that China, Russia, and Iran have used public diplomacy, propaganda, disinformation campaigns to portray their respective responses to the pandemic as superior to those of democracies. They emphasize the inability of democracies to quickly adopt the tough measures to address the virus, including restricting rights, weak healthcare systems of the United States, inefficiencies, inequalities in democracies. And also Chinese narratives have, in particular recently, amped up identifying the COVID epicenter to be at Fort Detrick in Maryland rather than Wuhan. So I think this sort of narrative was somewhat effective because you saw it repeated, in numerous media outlets, this assumption that non or hybrid democracies are hindered by messy democratic checks or bureaucracy and They don't have the obedient citizens to follow. Of course, this is swiftly countered by facts and successes of Taiwan and New Zealand and South Korea. But, there were also evidence of well-established democracies crippled by incompetence and bureaucracy. So the truth is, and the research has shown, that governance systems actually didn't necessarily affect outcomes in this battle. Another disappointment at the start of the crisis, of course, was the ineffectiveness of global institutions and bodies to respond. So with Brexit and Trump's vocal disdain, there had been, this weakening in our global democratic ecosystem for several years, and the crisis sort of revealed the catastrophic costs of isolationism and weak global cooperation. As many Italians said at the beginning of the crisis, the EU's paralysis and abandonment, hurt them. And then this has sort of come into play with vaccine distribution, nations accusing one another of hoarding. And though the EU stuck together, they were short of supply in the beginning. Anyway, China and Russia were able to seize upon this. And we've been tracking their sort of dual strategy of spreading disinformation around vaccines, COVAX, international response, at the same time engaging in vaccine diplomacy. And China's been very effective at providing vaccines around the world. Russian information ops that we've been looking at have focused on the superiority of Sputnik 5, et cetera. So in this regard, COVID really exacerbated this trajectory in the relationship between US, EU, China, Russia in the context of this competing governance systems. And the pandemic allowed them really to develop new information and tech operations around democracy narratives. So on the second component of research, which I mostly did with my great team at International IDEA, we looked specifically at the impact that measures of COVID had on democracy. And as you've rightly set up, Sergio, is that democracy was already backsliding prior to Corona. Countries were experiencing a rise in authoritarianism and far-right populism. And a crisis, war or otherwise, can and have resulted in executives pushing the envelope of their power. Fear and the monster under the bed is the beloved elixir of wannabe authoritarians everywhere. And COVID was the perfect tactic. It's important to note, though, that the adoption of very strict measures, including emergency powers, isn't undemocratic inherently. Representative democracy means electing leaders to make important life-saving decisions, and it's a sign democracy is actually working. But it's really critical to distinguish that from a lot of unnecessary restrictions that took place that were unrelated or purely self-interested abuses of power. Viktor Orban using Corona to trample on the rights of LGBTQ community. And also time is a factor. How long the state was holding on to measures sort of past their expiration date. So just the top lines really quickly is that we looked at 162 countries, and alarmingly, in 62% of them, we saw concerning developments from a democracy perspective, mostly in authoritarian and hybrid regimes. And the areas where we saw the biggest concern, 73% of countries limited speech. It was most pronounced in Asia Pacific, and states also concealed and tampered with COVID data. 56% of countries restricted media integrity, including punitive measures against journalists. And 53% of countries used military, excessive police force, arbitrary arrests, and/or contact tracing apps, all posing various challenges to personal security. And of course, as we know, half of the elections in 2020 were postponed. And the suspension of parliaments around the world really had a critical impact on oversight, and legislation was passed that otherwise would never have survived scrutiny. So what does all this mean? What are the longer term trends? And to the question of the panel, like, where does this lead us? To a resurgence in liberal democracy, or antagonistic blocs, or diversity and cooperation? At least in our research, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic really have put democracy under serious stress. It accelerated deterioration in many places, exposing different trust deficits. And the lack of clear cooperation between states at the start was alarming. And then, as I said, the exacerbation of this so-called governance competition, attempts to shift power dynamics through leveraging global pandemic failures and responses. President Xi recently used his keynote address to highlight the CCP's desire to set the tone for a global governance and promote its values on the world stage, highlighting COVID response. And related, COVID provide the opportunity for enhanced authoritarian interference operations through disinfo, finance, economic coercion, and development aid, pointing out democracy's failure to deliver, deep polarization, unresponsive representative bodies, while simultaneously highlighting their successes and economic governance models. I don't want to end on a negative note. I think there were positive opportunities that arose. There was a lot of advancement in innovations in elections, for example, special voting arrangements in South Korea, digitalization of parliamentary communications. We saw mobilization and protest movements to defend democracy and push back against encroachment on rights. But I also think there's been a wake-up call for countries to, take a good look at their governance structures to prepare for the next crisis. And we've seen sort of crisis management tools being introduced in several places, which I can discuss. And a recognition that this is a governance crisis as much as a health one. And so the response needs to be according. And it also, I think there was a demonstrated case for democracy at that global international ecosystem level, that it must be prioritized, not secondary to economic and security interests, but part and parcel to those interests. And I think we're hearing this more commonly in the halls of power, and hopefully events like Biden's summit will also echo this message. But I think all in all, nationalism is certainly the biggest threat going forward. The pandemic there will be more crises to come. We have climate change as a major crisis affecting all of us, and it's global. It requires global coordination, cooperation, and support. And I think there's a recognition collectively that we're going to be affected by and rely on one another to dig in on the need for and prove the value of democratic coordinated world order. So I hope that this is an opportunity for the future, even though the impacts of COVID have been, quite damaging from a democracy perspective. But I'm happy to share more on that through the questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. I think a lot of very important and sort of complex points to take away from there, starting from your initial points on the vaccine diplomacy and how that is reinforcing the power of geopolitical powers that are not necessarily liberal democratic powers, but at the same time, I got a sense near the end that you're saying the situation deteriorated, but the necessary wake-up call is now there because there were trends that were a long time coming. And now perhaps there is that momentum there to perhaps address them, including on the multilateral level. Kori, I want to move to you to also hear your thoughts, but perhaps to also ask the question of the panel, but specifically in the way it is reflected in U.S. foreign policy of the previous and the current administration, and that how does it look from the U.S., this redistribution of geopolitical, geoeconomic power? How is the U.S. reacting and what the vision is? Please, the floor is yours.
So I'm actually shocked that COVID hasn't had a much larger effect than it has. 600,000 Americans died in the last 18 months. And the United States isn't the country that has been most affected, as I don't need to tell Brazilians. And yet, despite all of the negative trends that Laura rightly identifies, I'm actually shocked governments haven't been overthrown. There hasn't been violence in the streets as a routine part of people's exasperation with government failures or grief at their losses. It's actually really shocking to me that you can have this big a perturbation in the international order and it to have so marginal a set of effects on states and on power. So to answer your question, Elena, the effects I think it had in the United States is I think it prevented Donald Trump's reelection by shutting down the economy. And I fear for my country what what the political effect would have been, as everybody on this call knows because of the conversation we had 5 years ago. I really do fear for my country if President Trump had been reelected. And I do believe one major driver of geopolitics was President Trump failing to be reelected. And I do believe his handling of the COVID crisis and the economic consequences of the crisis genuinely did cause people to vote for now President Biden. I also think that in the U.S., the consequences of COVID may actually be pretty long-standing, namely the recklessness of the previous administration, the unwillingness to acknowledge the nature, the magnitude of the challenge we were facing, and the sheer incapacity to work the levers of distributed power in the United States, I think have affected even many conservatives about the importance of people who actually care about governing the country, and the performative nihilism of many of my fellow Republicans isn't a good look in a pandemic. So I think, the American political system, it's important to remember that the American political system was built by people who distrusted government. And so all of the elaborate checks and balances, the management it takes in order to run the system have been highlighted, right? You see governors who've done better and worse. You see the immediate consequences in death rates. And it remains to be seen whether the most truculent, right, governors the governor of Tennessee, for example, now preventing the vaccination of children. What that's going to mean electorally, we don't yet know, but we know it at the national level. I don't think, though, to circle back to my original theme, I am genuinely surprised at how little an effect on geopolitics COVID has had, because it seems to me that even though there are going to be major effects of COVID, they don't appear to be effects on the most powerful states in the international order. The dynamic between the United States and China was well established before COVID, and COVID isn't the major thing driving it, nor does COVID appear to have had a major redistributive effect on power between the US and China, right? What free societies are good at, we're not good at having it right. We're good at getting it right. And I think that has played out in the pandemic, right? Russia and China thought they had a huge advantage at the start. China, because it could use its military as a non-consensual test bed for its vaccine. They could forcibly prevent people from leaving their homes in areas where outbreaks occurred. And they could control information pretty effectively domestically. And in the big sloppiness of the United States and other Western societies, you still can't get Americans to get vaccines or to wear masks, a significant part of the population that is preventing us from reaching herd immunity. And the government is powerless to make it compulsory. It seems to me illustrative that businesses and school districts are what is going to get us to herd immunity. I mean, the Indy 500, for goodness sake, set up vaccine vaccine stations and refused to let people into the arena unless they were vaccinated. Worldwide wrestling is getting people vaccinated. So the crazy upheaval of free societies is actually working, at least in my own provincial country's case, slowly but surely. Namely, the government isn't able to force people to do anything, but people's self-interest is dragging them towards sensible behavior, even if it's just, I want a free donut and they'll give me one if I got vaccinated. I mean, one governor made guns available if you got vaccinated. So it's crazy, but welcome to the United States of America. The drivers, so where I think there is going to be geopolitical effect from COVID is sadly in the developing world, because the economic shutdown, I mean, most of the developed economies are service economies, so they can be more self-sustaining when you get major disruptions. But for exporters of raw materials, for countries that don't have the go-go economies that can produce their own vaccines, for countries that are reliant on being small parts of sophisticated supply chains, I think those three things have collapsed in ways that will be geopolitically significant. I also think China's regrettable foreign policies during the pandemic have reflected poorly. What I can't figure out is, why does a China that isn't yet dominant in the international order doing things that are killing the goose that laid the golden egg? Because they actually are. Why would you activate the antibodies against your continued rise? But it looks to me like that's what China began doing before COVID and continues to do during and after COVID. For all of some Europeans' unhappiness with their governments, I don't see a major displacement of European power in the international order. I don't see major displacement of American power. In fact, what we are reminded of is how much the vibrancy of civil societies actually buffers free countries against major political upheaval, because people have the capacity to create change. The last thing I guess I would say is that, of course, this isn't yet over. I mean, in the United States, we're likely to have a major second wave in the fall because we won't reach herd immunity in time. But it's not just the United States that is going to have continued problems, as of course I don't need to tell our Brazilian colleagues that I think the major drivers of geopolitical power will continue to be the ability to solve problems domestically and internationally. And while my country is extremely bad at it at the moment, it's largely a myth that we've ever been able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. We mostly remember the eventual success, not the difficulty of getting there. So I don't think COVID will have a major effect. I do think China's choices to be really sharp-edged and aggressive will have major consequences. I think the fact that the United States and the other free societies are slowly getting their act together to be vaccine providers will, over the long run, have a substantial effect. And I think the relative effectiveness of different vaccines and the ecosystems technologically and economically that produce them that both invent them and distribute them will be the longer term effect, along with the collapse of integrated supply chains and the economic momentum that was pulling developing countries up. I think the second order effects are largely not going to be in the great powers and in the developed economies.
Thank you very much, Kori. Lots of points there, which I will not begin to summarize. And I will, if I get the chance, want to get back to you on a couple of those, including a bit more elaboration on US vaccine diplomacy, including in Latin America, and what the effects of that will be, but also the different nuances in Trump and Biden's China policy, including strengthening that democratic due diligence in supply chains, etc. So, which I think is a new thing, but also very, very poignant in both the EU and the US as a change, as you said, in the democratic powers getting their act together in this systemic rivalry. But I want to turn to Oliver. Before I do so, I also want to ask everyone on the conversation, if they have questions, feel free to already raise your virtual hand so I can slowly get to you once Oliver concludes. But Oliver, redistribution of power is nothing new to you. You've been writing about this for over a decade, although it was in a different context of rising powers and BRICS. But how does this look to you now, not only in the COVID context, but looking at Brazil, for example, and the way it has not lived up to be what the BRICS expected Brazil to be in terms of its position in the geopolitical environment. So your thoughts and reactions to what has been said, but also I think we're all hoping for that Latin American perspective and the impact of COVID on Latin America, and how does that make geopolitics look from Latin America?
Thank you, Elena. It's a great pleasure to be here. And these were so rich presentations that I kept changing the order of my comments, seeking to respond to all the amazing things that we've heard from Laura and Kori. I won't be able to do that, but I'll seek to make sure that this is as cohesive as possible. And I think one thing we've heard from both speakers already is that there are, of course, short-term effects of the pandemic on democracy. There are long-term effects. And it's difficult for us right now to have a complete understanding because we don't know when the pandemic will end. And I think an interesting parallel is that the global financial crisis, you may argue, produced or contributed to the rise of Donald Trump, and as a consequence, did have a negative effect on democracy, whereas the pandemic actually helped reduce the probability of Trump's reelection. You could say contributed to his defeat, and that in turn, has been positive for U.S. democracy. And the Biden victory has been a disaster for many authoritarian-minded leaders around the world. And in Brazil, that's very much the case. I would say that the departure of Brazil's self-professed anti-globalist foreign minister and the environment minister, both extremely controversial, which have really contributed to the toxic image that Brazil has today, are a fairly direct consequence of Brazil's need to adapt to a post-Trump world, because it could swim in the slipstream of Trump, where basically the entire international community was waking up every morning and saying, what is Trump tweeting? What is he saying? How is he destabilizing international order? And Bolsonaro was able to benefit from that because he knew that at no stage the United States would pressure Brazil on human rights issues, on democracy issues, on the catastrophic pandemic response, on environmental issues. And that's changing now. We sometimes, would think of the Brazilian government as the president as somebody who's irrational, but I think he's very rational in that sense. And I think the changes he's making to his cabinet are a response to the new reality, which is that there is a government in the United States which is pressuring Brazil still so far, thankfully, I think, behind closed doors, because that's the way to engage the Brazilian government, not via Twitter like Macron has done a few years ago. So these are, in a sense, in the short term, positive consequences for democracy. But I would agree with what we've heard so far, that it wasn't really about democracy versus non-democracy, but much more about the capacity to deliver public goods. We've seen non-democratic governments being fairly successful in containing the spread of COVID, but also very incompetent authoritarian leaders. And a democracy, I think it has been the same. If Bolsonaro were to lose the elections next year, it will certainly be in part because of the mismanagement of the pandemic. So in that sense, if that were to come true and there's something that suggests his approval ratings are decreasing, his chances for re-election are decreasing, we could say that at least in the short term, two actors, individuals who've really gone out of their ways to erode democracies in the United States and Brazil have been swept aside because of this massive pandemic challenge. But again, I think we could see long-term consequences here over the coming years. And I agree with Kori on that one, that in the region, and I'll just make a few points about democracy and sort of geopolitics in Latin America, and then make some concluding remarks on global dynamics. I think that the medium long-term consequences for Latin America and Latin American democracy are likely to be devastating of the pandemic. We, of course, have to remind ourselves that Latin America had already experienced massive protests in many countries. Seems like a different world right now, but I was a different age. I was in late 2019 in Santiago during the mass protests. And that was and we were, talking about 2019 as one of the most, the years where Latin America saw mass instability really across the entire region: Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Honduras, Haiti, Nicaragua. Everywhere, people were taking the streets. While there are many different reasons, it was usually about the incapacity of democratic or of political systems to deliver. It was about frustration, the reversal of expectations, inequality, slow economic growth, a lack of transparency, corruption. So the pandemic, I would say it's probably in more than in any other region in the world, also considering that no region grew slower than Latin America prior to the pandemic. No other region has exposed the structural weaknesses of political systems as brutally as the pandemic has done in Latin America. And the risks to democracy will be tremendous because you add all the ingredients you need to facilitate the rise of outsiders who say that the entire economic elite is incompetent and that somebody from the outside is necessary. And I think that's why I've been spending quite some time following the example of Chile over the past months. And I think that that may be a country that could escape that cycle that we've been seeing for so many years in the region of discontent, protest, the emergence of an outsider who promises radical change and disappointment, because fairly predictably that leader is unable to deliver. Now, Chile may go terribly wrong, but I think it's a country that's making a genuine effort to some extent to address the structural challenges the entire region faces within a fairly organized way. And I think it really merits quite some attention in that respect. Because what we're seeing right now in Haiti, in Cuba, but also in Colombia, what I think likely we'll see in many countries over the next months, will be tremendously difficult to manage within a democratic context. Also because the pandemic has contributed to the reversal of what I consider to be the greatest progress that Latin America has made in the terms of consolidating its democracy, and that is the terrible effects the pandemic has had on public education and really the ability to provide access to education to the poor in Latin America. That has been really the key factor over the past 30 years, I would say, that stands out of how the region has been able to address its very low social mobility, high inequality, and the region has been, unfortunately, been leading the world in terms of the number of days that schools have been closed. I must say I was, as many of you who have read the news about Latin America, we've had months where the bars were open and the schools were closed. And in many countries around the world, it was the opposite. And I think that as a symbol says so much about the long-term price that the region is likely to pay, because we will have a COVID generation, people who will suffer for many, many years, particularly those without access to public schools. And those are, of course, the ones who are most vulnerable to organized crime, transnational crime. I think the big winner in Latin America are non-state actors, people who groups that need to recruit, and their big enemy is public schooling, because that's the most powerful alternative that teenagers and the young across the region have to stay out of organized crime. So in that sense, I would still say overall, despite the fact that the pandemic has felled Donald Trump and that that may contribute to the defeat of Bolsonaro, I think in the long term, particularly from a Latin America perspective, probably negative perspectives for democracy. And just to finish, on a global scale, I would also agree with Kori. I was trying to, I sometimes disagree with what Kori says and writes, so I was kind of looking forward to that. But on that one, I actually also agree that I don't think the pandemic changed the essence of what will shape international politics over the coming decades, which is the return of great power politics, which is, I think, from a sort of Latin American perspective, has already been priced in basically. You can see it in the 5G debate, where there's a clear element of the politicization of globalization, where companies can no longer just say, where can I produce, where is it most efficient, effective, didn't really have to care about global risk analysis, but now that reality is very much here. It will spread to the financial sector. I have no doubt that the kinds of dynamics we're seeing now when it comes to Huawei, where the Brazilian government is facing daily pressure from Washington and Beijing about how to proceed, will also affect all kinds of international standards involving self-driving cars, internet governance, and all that. And I think that will be the major challenge and not the pandemic. And as a final point, I think that the tendency of the return of great power politics is that issues like the promotion of democracy will be secondary, because great powers, when the United States has promoted and aided democracy in many cases throughout history, but when that collides with broader geopolitical issues about, for example, containing Chinese power, then democracy promotion tends not to prevail. So I would say the tendency is that the return of great power politics may still make promoting democracy possible, but it will make it much, much more difficult because there's other concerns which will just, make it to the White House as a top priority rather than democracy. But in some cases, competition can actually produce positive outcomes. And the vaccine diplomacy race is an example of that. China has saved, and again, I was happy not to have taken a Chinese vaccine, but it would be wrong to deny that Chinese vaccine diplomacy has saved millions of lives in or thousands of lives, at least in Latin America. There were no alternatives. Latin Americans would have, of course, preferred to take, Pfizer or Moderna or whatever, but they were not available. And it was clearly noted across the continent that China was exporting or selling vaccines at a time when its own population had not been vaccinated, of course, within geopolitical, objective in mind, to fill the vacuum that was emerging in Latin America. The United States was slow to respond, is now finally responding. I think it's about even now. But I think without this great power politics component, the United States may have been slower to address or to deal with the growing perception that China was winning the vaccine race in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions with regard to the various issues you've raised. I already see 2 hands up, and I want to go to Charles and Sergio who have raised their hand. But before I do that, I want to raise 2 questions to all the panelists that for me are at the core of everything or much of what has been said, not everything. My first question relates to Oliver's last point, but I think it's for everyone, and has democracy promotion, and I would even call it the defense of democracy in Europe and the US, also become part of geopolitics, in the sense that we see this systemic rivalry where geopolitics is now also about managing to maintain the attractiveness and the functioning of the liberal democratic model itself. So can we still say democracy promotion is not geopolitics when we're talking about a rivalry that is systemic, which has to do with which of the 2 systems perhaps will be sustainable, will persevere? So my first question is, can we really unlink this sort of democracy conversation, the Biden Alliance for Democracy, the discussion about due diligence of supply chains, where we have to look at democracy in the countries where the supply chains pass through and our products are produced, the EU's democracy action plan? Can we really say these are not also geopolitical? So that's my first question for all the panelists when I come back to you. And the second would be, where does that leave multilateralism and multilateral organizations whose own ability to deliver has also been challenged, not only by COVID, but earlier, but at this moment where we are at this moment of the return to great powers, the systemic rivalry? What is it a make or break moment for them, and where will that go? So I leave these very simple questions here, and then I'll turn to the audience to open the conversation. We'll take 3 questions and I'll come back to the speakers. So I have Sergio, then Charles Kupchan, and Arturo Sarukan. So Sergio.
Well, actually, Elena, you have elegantly stolen my question. But let me elaborate a little bit more on that, because I'm in agreement with you that in spite of the fact that Oliver's sort of realistic premise is correct, that economic interests normally trump ideological ones, I think we should not forget that Biden has said that the defining battle of the 20th century is the battle between liberal democracy and authoritarian regimes, right? And I think we cannot dismiss this as like sheer rhetoric. I think there is a component of ideology in the great powers politics. And I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that in the same vein that Elena has stressed. More specifically, Oliver and all the others, how do you see transatlantic relations playing out in this respect? How much Europe and the US see eye to eye in this respect, in the realm of great powers politics? And finally, and even more specifically, how do you guys see this reflecting into climate change negotiations? To what extent clashes, competition among great powers politics, great powers, can sort of preclude or make it extremely difficult for negotiations concerning climate change to advance?
Thank you very much, Sergio, and thanks for bringing the climate question in. Charles Kupchan?
Hi, everyone. I had a couple of questions I wanted to get smarter on, particularly from our Brazilian friends. The first is that, contrary to, I think, at least my own expectations, the pandemic has not fueled populist forces. In many respects, it's strengthened the political center. Biden beat Trump. In Germany, AfD has been lagging in the polls. Salvini has not been doing well. National Rally has not been doing well. And so I guess that the answer is that public said, we want responsible leaders. We don't want whack jobs. What's happening in Brazil? Has the pandemic turned people against Bolsonaro? I mean, there are a lot of things that have turned people against Bolsonaro, but I'd be interested in hearing about the relationship between the pandemic and populism, because theoretically speaking, it could advantage the extremes, not the center. What's the picture in Brazil? And then the second question I'm interested in is, tell us a little bit about how Trump's defeat has knock-on effects abroad. I mean, my gut tells me that Biden's victory hurts populists around the world, and that when Trump was in office, it helped populists around the world. Is that the case in Brazil? If the Republicans take back the House next year and then win the presidency, how is that likely to impact political views and forces in a place like Brazil?
Many thanks, Charles, and thanks for bringing in midterms, and I would add the Brazilian elections. So interesting, extremely interesting. Thanks. And Arturo Sarukan, and then we go back to the speakers.
Thank you, Elena, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to join you. As I was listening to the presentations, I sort of my gut reaction was that we may actually be talking about two different cleavages currently operating at the same time. The cleavage that I think the pandemic exposed, which isn't between left and right or authoritarian regimes and liberal democracies, it's between efficient and non-efficient governments, and that cleavage has really differentiated the ability of governments in addressing the social and economic effects of the pandemic, and the way those societies will respond, both in terms of in the case of most of Latin America, certainly, starting from Mexico, where I'm from, all the way down to the Southern Cone, potential social tensions, the potential breakdown of social cohesion in many of the countries. We're already seeing some of that being turbocharged, for example, in Central America, with the combined effects of the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, plus the effects of climate change and climate disruption in that region of the Americas. So you've got that first cleavage between efficient and non-efficient governments, and then you've got another one more structural, which I think is one of the issues we've been sort of discussing around the fringes, which is that the larger cleavage of the international system right now seems to be between open and closed societies, and whether you frame it in terms of defending liberal democracy, whether as Elena was asking, is democratic promotion being used as a geopolitical tool by different countries? That is really playing a role. And then if on top of that you build in the potential Thucydides trap in which China and the US may be falling, for those of us who are in DC, we're seeing probably the most important recalibration of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War.
Just play with it.
It's not only driven by what Trump viewed as the relationship between the US and China. It's bipartisan, Republican and Democrats, I think, increasingly in the city. I live in Washington, so that's why I'm using the city. In this city, increasingly believe that the statu quo ante with China is broken, doesn't work, whether it's on the technology trade side, whether it's on the geopolitical side, that statu quo ante needs to be revisited. And that recalibration, which was in part the underlying message of Biden's trip to Europe. He went to 3 European summits, NATO, G7, well, G7 includes others, but G7, NATO, and the bilateral summit with Russia. And sort of the underlying message was, yes, I'm back. The US is back. We have your backs, but please let me go and deal, or please, we all need to go and deal with China. And how that will affect countries in the Americas, particularly in South America, that have China as their number one trading partner, commodities driven, etc., which isn't the case for Mexico. Mexico is in another basket. That, I think, is also an interesting discussion. And then on top of this is sort of the recalibration of countries that are angling as to whether we're going to have a return of Trumpism in 2024, whether it's Trump or a new Trumpian figure within the Republican Party. And therefore, how much do they engage with Biden, the Biden administration, in terms of Biden's geopolitical views and national security and foreign policy driver the next 3 years? That is, a lot of countries may actually decide, both allies and foes may decide to sit on the fence and wait and see what happens in 2024, and whether, as I hope I'm wrong, but as I think, Trumpism and Trump are not an anomaly. They're a manifestation of a much more troubling trend in U.S. democracy. Just look at what's happening with the Republican Party in the United States today, and it's really scary. And so I think a lot of countries will also be looking at that and saying, why don't we wait and sort of give in and engage with the Americans, but let's not put all our eggs in that basket, because who knows, in 2024, we may be back to what we saw these last 4 years in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. And I have to apologize. I made the classic mistake of a moderator who happens to know some people on the call, because I didn't ask you to introduce yourselves. And of course, Arturo was formerly the Mexican ambassador to DC, and Charles Kupchan, you all know, is at the Council on Foreign Relations and at Georgetown. So apologies for that. And Sergio, of course, is the director of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute. So apologies for that. I'll ask the next round of people who ask questions to introduce themselves. But we have quite a few and profound points. So I'll ask the speakers to respond to a selection of those in reverse order. So maybe I'll start with Oliver, because there are quite a few points on Latin America and Brazil.
Yeah, thank you. I will only address some of them, but they're profoundly thought-provoking. And there is a discussion about whether democracy promotion, what the relationship between democracy promotion and great power politics is. And I think that that sort of comes down to a discussion I've been having with several friends who are part of the Biden administration now, this idea of a summit of the democracies, which was being discussed in a way. And I think I've read several pieces. There was a piece by Vindman, who's one of the discharged members of the Trump administration, and several others who have made this this proposal. And I think there's, of course, two problems that need to be in that context. And I think they symbolize some of the difficulties that lie ahead. The first is, what is the legitimacy of a country which has had a near-death experience of its democracy to lead an effort to defend democracy? That's not to say that I'm not in favor of that, but it is a question that must be asked. Whether the United States can in any or should be the country to actually promote this kind of discussion, or whether it should be perhaps New Zealand or another country which hasn't actually been through such a moment. The second, of course, is this issue of who should be part of this. And then you come immediately into these treacherous waters of what's the relationship between geopolitical interests of having, for example, India on board for the United States, very important as a geopolitical ally, but it's certainly a country which you may argue should not be part right now of a democracy summit. Then the question arises, is it a summit to where you want sort of ideal democracy to be on, or is the mere invitation of a leader who's shown clear authoritarian tendencies sort of a way to pressure that person into becoming more democratic at home? I think there's a lot of issues here but I would still believe that, as always, and everybody who's promoting sort of liberal ideas on the global stage must always be prepared, of course, to confront these kinds of questions, which are inevitable. But I do certainly hope that that will continue to be, an emphasis of the Biden administration. Now, just very briefly about the knock-on effects abroad. I clearly think that when Bolsonaro ran, most people said this guy cannot win. But some people believed, well, Trump won, so anything can happen in a way. So in a way, Trump's victory gave legitimacy to somebody like Bolsonaro to say, I represent the future. And even though Trump didn't really care about Bolsonaro, these bilateral meetings did to some extent strengthen the president, at least when it comes to his most loyal supporters. And it, as I said initially, allowed him to carve out a space to pursue his project in a much more tranquil way, unperturbed by the United States, as long as Trump was in power. And I think that Biden's victory changes that dynamic. Now, as always, I think there is no question that Bolsonaro will try to utilize Trump's fraud claims to his benefit. He is saying explicitly that dark forces who stole the US election are planning to come down to Brazil in 2022 and do the same. And a lot of those tactics are being used to destabilize Brazilian democracy. I think there's, I would say today here that if we in Brazil have a January 6th type experience in late 2022 with hundreds of armed people storming Congress, a fairly low number of deaths, and a ultimately successful transition of power without the incumbent conceding, that's my best case scenario for Brazil. I hope that that will come to pass, because all the other alternatives are much, much worse, be it a re-election of the president or a successful January 6th, quote unquote, for the incumbent. So I think in that sense, the US experience has plenty of consequences that will reverberate in other countries around the world for many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Kori, I could see you thinking when the various questions about democracy and geopolitics were coming up. So
that is absolutely true, Elena. My wheels were spinning. Okay, first on democracy promotion. Yes, it's certainly true that the United States is a damaged messenger for democracy promotion because of our difficulties at home. And the best thing we can do is argue that we're promoting democracy because it's hard even for us with an institutionalized couple hundred years of experience. But that is a good argument covering a weak performance, I think, is the truth. The other message that I think is important coming from the United States is that what saved us is institutions and the rule of law. And strengthening institutions is the best investment that democratizing and democratized countries can make. To your question about multilateralism, Elena, which I think is a really good one. What shows up in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs polling over the last several years is how much Americans actually like international cooperation, right? One of the major drags on President Trump's popularity and support is the fact that he was nasty to people who are our actual friends. And my mom doesn't like that. My mom actually likes to work cooperatively with others to solve problems. And she especially likes being nice to people who are sentimentally attached to us and us to them. So I think what I think I see in Biden foreign policy, there was a really good article in the magazine Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago about how Biden is playing an outside-in strategy, Namely, he is advancing democracy abroad in order to strengthen it at home. And that strikes me as likely true and a pretty smart political play on his part. On the midterm elections, so a couple of reflections on that. First, Republicans are 80% likely to retake the House of Representatives just because of the actual terrain of what seats are coming up and retirements and things like that. Moreover, we've at least got a 50-50 shot of retaking the Senate. Historically, the opposition party in a midterm election picks up 34 seats in the House. Republicans will almost surely underperform that for all of the reasons of the position that so many Republicans have taken about the election not being valid, right? That's actually an extremely unpopular position. It cost Republicans the 2 Georgia Senate seats, more than just about anything else. Because as Peggy Noonan said, most people don't like the smell of sulfur. Missouri, I think, is going to be the bellwether for the Senate because it should be a Republican state. It's overwhelmingly a conservative state. And yet Republicans are running deeply unpopular and compromised candidates. And so it may well be a Democratic pickup. So I think the Senate will be more interesting than the House. And the other thing that I think will be important for the midterms is whether the 10 Republicans in the House who voted for the president can get reelected. Paul Ryan is running a super PAC effort to raise a ton of money to get them reelected. Liz Cheney is probably the most interesting canary in a coal mine. She's likely to win, but she's got 8 primary challengers. What Republican polling shows, the internal Republican polling shows, is that the challenge for Republican candidates will be just how popular Biden's policies are. And Biden, again, is playing that very smart by saying elected Republicans don't like my policies, but actual Republican voters do. And the polling bears that out. And so what you see, you can already see, is Republican candidates lurching towards the culture wars because the United States actually is a predominantly conservative country. And the Democratic Party has moved further left than the Republican Party has moved right. The advantage Democrats have is that Joe Biden is a politician that's uniquely difficult to stick that on because he's boring and he's chummy. And so it makes it harder for Republicans to get traction on him, which is why they're not focusing on Biden. They're focusing on, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other more incendiary left on the waiting on the sidelines challenge. I think that's really important. And if I were an American ally, I would be hedging my bets. And so what is surprising is the extent to which that's not happening. That what you see is an enormous sigh of relief on the part of the United States' Democratic allies, and those allies working to try and assist the forces of democracy in the United States. The Canadians are uniquely brilliant at this, of partnering with governors and the Chamber of Commerce and reaching into American democracy to have a stabilizing role. But even look at the extent to which European allies are cutting the United States slack, because they actually want democracy to succeed in the United States and they want it to be geopolitically significant. Because what middle and smaller powers understand about great power competition is that a liberal order that they have the ability to consensually participate in and to shape the rules of, that is the post-1945 order, is the order that will be most advantageous to their interests. So what you see is other democratic middle and small powers, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, South Korea, most of Europeans, trying to uphold the order when the United States is being extraordinarily reckless.
Thank you very much, Kori. I'm sharing from the chat in case people haven't seen that Charles Kupchan says he sadly generally agrees with your assessment about the election. So in case people are not looking at the chat, and then he adds, that's why it's so important for Biden to pass key legislation now. And Ian is doing what I wanted to do, in the absence of a European on the panel, which is to give a bit of a view from Brussels. A lot of worry about the midterms and after, even though it's unarticulated. And on that note of a European not being on the panel, I was going to turn to Laura, but also ask her, since the Alliance on Securing Democracy does a lot of work both in Europe and the US, both Oliver and Kori have talked about, can the US be sort of the flag bearer of democracy, given what's the recent turbulence in the US and democracy? Yeah. But how does it look about, could the EU be the flag bearer of democracy, given the various policies that are being rolled out? Public opinion polls today, I saw somewhere new EU opinion polls where 70% of Europeans are against illiberal democracy as a term. So that's interesting. So I want to turn to you for your reactions to the various questions, but also perhaps to give that perspective.
Yes, there were so many excellent remarks and my brain's exploding a little bit, but I really will handle that democracy promotion one first, because I spent 22 years at the National Democratic Institute, one of the largest democracy promotion organizations out there, and I've lived all over the world. And I have a very complex feelings and relationship with this idea of democracy promotion, because I've seen how it's backfired and been, utilized in different countries where I've worked. I mean, I worked for 7 years in Cambodia, for example, and I saw how China could use sort of the democracy promotion angle of the EU and the US to advance their economic interests. In other words, like Hun Sen, come to us, we have no strings attached, move away from, Western donors, and we're not going to bother you about human rights while we take all your land and cut down all your trees. But also, I think I agree with both Oliver and Kori in that we do, the United States, given our recent events, have to approach this with a degree of both humility, but also a little bit of this, we're all in this together. And I mean, it's really interesting to me because that's always how I approached my job, is I never approached it like, we're American, let us teach you how great we are and how good our democracy is, but rather, we're all in this together. It's a goal, none of us have achieved it, and we're all facing similar problems right now. And that's what I said in my remarks. I mean, more than ever, if we're talking about information operations and how to handle that, building democratic resilience in durable communities, because the biggest problem with disinformation is not necessarily the channels of disinformation, but the fact that we, the people, are like believing it, buying it, seeking it out. How do we build and inoculate the public? And I think we have a lot to learn. And I hope that we approach this summit with that in mind. Like, what does Finland have to teach us about building like civic and media literacy education for children, and how can that build this resistance to disinformation? And actually, I think it's really interesting because I've heard that it's actually not called the Summit of Democracies, but the Summit for Democracy. And that is an important distinction, because I would hope that it wouldn't be so-called democratic nations, and then you get into the difficulty of like, is India a democracy or not? But rather, this is for democracy. We want Democrats here, lowercase d. And that includes Democrats from authoritarian states, et cetera. I hope that's what's going to happen. And I hope it really does focus on how we're going to work together. Now, your point, Elena, on and Ian's point, and I've been living in Sweden for a while, and every time I was interacting with MPs from Sweden or other places, certainly there's relief, but cautious. As someone said, I'm nauseously optimistic. So there is a sense that, there was the big jubilation, after Bush lost and sort of this overexcitement about Obama among many Europeans that I know. But also now they're like, okay, we're not going to give you that pass quite yet. So in my conversations, it's like, yes, we're happy. Yes, Biden won, but you guys could switch in 4 years and we're back where we started and you're pull out of Paris and Iran. So I think that there is this hesitancy, particularly people pointed out to me a lot, because our executive is so strong and our Congress is relatively weak compared to other parliamentary systems and other countries that, we don't pass much legislation. So executive orders can take the day and things can change really quickly, particularly on foreign policy. So I think there's happiness, but caution. And on the point of Trump's loss, which someone had mentioned about, did that sort of put a stake in, rising populism around the world? I actually think, yes, of course, Trump was an inspiration to lots of rising authoritarians, but also his loss is an inspiration. And I think someone said this, Oliver, maybe, that, the big lie is now the new black. I lost, ergo fraud is now being used by Myanmar military, Bibi Netanyahu, and others. So this is going to be the new thing that we have to really watch out for. So in a way, Trump's loss is, and then the way the narratives around his loss and the big lie, I think we're going to see around elections around the world, and it will be a new challenge for us going forward. And on I think Arturo and Oliver both made really important points about this cleavage issue. It's not really between democracies and authoritarianism, which was what I was saying in my remarks, but between efficiency and inefficiency. And that has also, I think, given fuel to populism to latch on to the whole, look, the social contract's broken, democracy is not delivering. The elites have captured the system. Look at the rich people that control our Congress, our parliament, et cetera. Ergo, look at the inequality. This is a really important fuel. And with an economic backlash that we're seeing, I think we need to be mindful that that will be the calling card for many far-right populists. And finally, and I've written a lot down, but on this issue of that COVID didn't really harm things as much as we thought. I think, and we didn't see protests, etc. I think that's true from maybe an American or European point of view, but we saw massive protests in Guinea, Burundi, Georgia, many different parts of the world where people were protesting against India, Serbia, against sort of the outcomes of COVID and government responses or government overreach that were related to COVID. And I also think it's really important to look at a rise in illiberalism during COVID, whether I didn't even go into, I have lots of research on the impact on women in particular, and how COVID has disproportionately affected women, pushing women out of the workforce in record numbers during COVID. Women were more greatly affected as they are the majority of healthcare workers. Women were more greatly affected because they are in the informal sector in many countries around the world. So I think we've seen a huge gender impact. We've seen a rise in domestic violence. We've seen attacks on women's equality. We've also seen attacks on minorities. So you look at India and Modi's COVID plan singling out Muslim minorities. And so I think while it could have been worse for sure, and democracy, we didn't see a huge upheaval in many countries around the world or coup d'etats, although in some places, yes. I still do think that there are long-lasting damages to the COVID pandemic on sort of democratic strength in countries. But again, as I said in my remarks, I hope it does turn out to be a little bit of a wake-up call, and that there is some sort of recognition of that, like some sort of recognition that, gee, our healthcare system is really unequal. Perhaps there's something that should be done to address that. Or, gee, our elections are not prepared to handle a pandemic. Let's get in some special voting arrangements so the next crisis, we can be better prepared to deliver quality elections and give people their franchise. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, thank you. I mean, I'm particularly glad you went into the women issue, because in Latin America, the combination of informality and the nature of jobs that women carry out has really contributed to them being one of the groups that have been most manifestly affected by the effects of the pandemic. And I think women as a constituency will perhaps play a very big role in future elections in various parts of the world, and that they're very important part of democracy. We even saw that in the US elections. Sergio, you have your hand up. I don't know is this for a new question? Okay, so Sergio, and please feel free to raise your hands. We still have some time. So Sergio.
Well, let me just bring back the issue of climate change that was not addressed. I don't need to tell you anything. It's difficult to exaggerate how relevant it is, right? And so my question was, and maybe I can sort of gently drag Isabella Teixeira to the discussion to address this issue. How do you see this playing out in the context of great power politics?
Thank you, Sergio, for getting back to that all-important issue. Also because, if I'm not mistaken, it was yesterday when Secretary of State Blinken said he was reaching out to Russia on some agreement to formulate some common goals on climate. So it is a big question. Is climate the policy area that will sort of help bridge certain geopolitical levels? Oh, sorry, I thought you had finished.
No, I had finished, but I had a second thought, which is cyber war, right? What is the state of the art in this respect? This are on the verge of a sort of decoupling in terms of let's say, of communication systems, of the internet, or not, right? How far that can go?
Thank you, Sergio. So cyberspace,
and climate change. Talking about major drivers of change in the global stage.
So to what extent and how will they affect geopolitical balances? Also, both issues
and economic globalization as such, right?
Indeed. And to highlight, these were also both key topics of the four, if not the three, Biden meetings of the four he had when he visited Europe. I want to ask Isabella Teixeira, would you like to come in on the climate question?
Sergio is not a friend, I think so. God, now just what I can say that the debate about the geopolitical aspect of climate change, in my personal opinion, it's actually related to climate security. And indeed, the climate crisis bring everyone together because we exposed to climate crisis, vulnerability and risks and threats. And what they have today, two different movements: alliance to put in practice mitigation strategy, and this means how the countries come together, and developed countries, they come together to mitigate. And China is absolutely key to be addressed, as Obama administration managed before Paris Agreement in 2014, together with Xi Jinping. And today, it seems that you can have an arrangement again, United States and China to try to move this better because of the Chinese emissions. The other side is that you have alliance for mitigation, but you don't have alliance for adaptation. And again, adaptation is critical because it exposes the vulnerabilities and risks and the social inequalities and the difference among different countries around the world, and developing economies will be absolutely exposed. But not only developing economies, developed also what's happened today in the United States, for example, because in fires, it's a good example of how climate exposed all the countries consider adaptation requirements. So my feeling is that to have this gap between mitigation and adaptation, geopolitical arrangements, and how indeed to bring additional funds to address solutions, and international cooperation, in my today, it's not necessarily have all the tools to address this. And second, we cannot forget the power of the economic interests, or the power of the economic interests to address some new alliance. For example, the Green Global South, based on agriculture and food security. You can come together, Brazil, China, India, Africa countries, they are debating this. It happened 2 weeks ago. And on the other side of the country, you have the debate, you have the pan-Atlantic arrangement trying to bring Atlantic countries like United States, Brazil, European countries, Africa countries. There's a push. I think that to have somebody with an open mic, I cannot say, but only to conclude, Elena, I'm sorry.
Pardon my French, but shut the fuck up.
No, calma. You are not Bolsonaro. Come on.
May I rephrase it in English?
Please.
Would you mind muting, please?
Good. Great. So only to add the thing that we have these different movements, and that's why I think that COP26 will be probably middle conference, but what is absolutely important behind the scenes, what are the arrangements that the new climate clubs will probably bring to put in practice mitigation and also to address or not democracy. We cannot forget that the central, you have two age together, climate and also digital/technological age. They are coming together, and indeed what's critical, what's the citizenship that will emerge from this new contest, this new global contest. And this is a really key question, because climate change is not only for millions of environments. Climate change is a geopolitical issue today. And the next step next year that we'll discuss Stockholm plus 50. After 50 years, indeed, what are the critical aspects of the planetary boundaries, how the global, all the countries come together, because nature, we are absolutely exposed to nature crisis. So climate crisis comes together with nature crisis. It's very important to understand this. And also, in my perspective, Sergio, I think that we should pay really attention what climate driver will push, considering democracy and also the new geopolitical and geoeconomic and geotechnological arrangements that the countries are looking for to address. But for me, the debate is completely different than it was in 6 years ago in Paris negotiation, for example. And it's very important to be observed. And in Brazil, only to illustrate, it's not deforestation, it's the peak of the problem. But it's not this. What is the key asset, in my personal opinion, why it's important to preserve the forest based on climate global security. And this is the geopolitical asset. We need to shift the way to approach things and really understand what are the key issues that are globally very important to be addressed, and how the countries, the great power will come together. My feeling that come together in groups and alliance to mitigate, forgetting exactly how developing economies and vulnerable countries will be to react, consider adaptation. And this is absolutely critical. And the next dispute in UK, in Glasgow, will emerge this, okay, during the negotiation. Adaptation funds versus mitigation funds. $100 billion is for mitigation, okay, the other side of the coin. Let me give this the answer. And China, I know that China and India and other countries are looking for to put this on the table to pressure the geopolitical global arrangements on climate. I don't know if I answered you, but I think that
thoroughly, Isabella, as expected, and I'm sorry for my outburst.
Please, no, I think we were all entertained, but I did want to say thank you to Minister Teixeira, because you modestly did not introduce yourself, but if my mental calculations are correct, you were Minister of the Environment when the Paris Agreement was signed. So that's
yes, I was.
So that's actually, it was quite an important time.
I'm guilty, okay? I'm guilty, I'm sorry.
I hope the world will remember in a good way. So I see no more raised hands, and I want to turn to the panel on these all important questions of cyber and climate and how they will define geopolitics, but I cannot help but notice that this is a discussion about geopolitics. We really have not mentioned defense and security, which shows us we are in a new environment where we're discussing very different types of threats, because this would not happen 20 years ago to discuss geopolitics without discussing military balances. So while you just share your thoughts on climate and cyber, I also wanted to ask to what extent will military balances play a role? To what extent defense budgets will play a role in the geopolitics of the future? I'm going a bit beyond COVID now, but I think it's important to think about it since we're discussing defense. Ian is saying it's signaling to me that this is a tomorrow issue. So I'm sorry for bringing it up now, but maybe I'm warming up the clouds. And I have to admit, this morning I was reviewing something on the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So I plead guilty. I may be influenced by that. So if maybe we can touch on defense as well, but mostly climate and cyber then. So I'll go back to Kori then and change the order of speakers.
Sure. So I will start with climate. First of all, I very much appreciate Isabella's perspective. That was really helpful for shaping my own thinking. So thanks. I do think climate has the climate issue plays very strongly in the direction of exacerbating the friction between global haves and have-nots, because while everybody is being affected, wealthy countries have the ability to buffer and reconstitute after climate disasters. And I think that friction is likely to be exacerbated unless the wealthy countries do a whole lot more. The likeliest avenue for that is through innovation. Again, exactly as Isabella says, we need mitigation strategies, not just prevention strategies. So I do think the Biden administration understands that this is an easy, important pickup for the United States, both as a soft power issue, as an economic driver domestically, and also as an important part of reconstituting American leadership internationally. I would point out, though, that the United States in 2018 was the first country to meet its Paris Climate Accord goals, despite the Trump administration's withdrawal from the treaty, despite regulatory rollback, despite overt federal hostility by the agencies like the Bureau of Land Management. The combination of the great golden state of California setting independent regulatory standards, Mike Bloomberg's money sloshing all over the place, Apple Computer's sanctimoniousness, and my mom actually wanting there to be a planet Earth for her grandchildren, pushed the United States, despite federal government opposition, into meeting its Paris Climate Accord goals. And that is the saving grace of my sweet provincial country. So that on climate. On cyber, I think cyber cuts the other direction. Namely, the United States is the country most exposed because the country most globally connected and most economically open. Attitudes have shifted strongly, and government attention to the problem has shifted strongly in the last couple of years as Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran had a lot of fun making a lot of mischief and making a lot of profit in ransomware and cyber attacks. But I think the last couple of days are quite instructive in this regard. Namely, somebody, very likely the National Security Agency, managed to black out our evil, the ransomware that were responsible for the latest attack. This seems to me a good example of democracies being bad at having it right, but good at getting it right. Namely, we had the technological ability to do a lot about this. We didn't bother, or we were uncomfortable with the state having that power. And now people are exasperated enough that they actually want something done about this. So you see the tools of free societies being harnessed to the advantage of free societies, namely what the US government was capable of doing in the last couple of days would have been impossible without the Dutch intelligence service giving us important information, without having multilateral cooperation in private intelligence channels, in more public free society government channels. So you see the mobilization of free societies getting serious about addressing a challenge that we are uniquely vulnerable to.
Thank you, Kori. I'll move to Laura now.
Well, Kori stole some of my thunder. Thank you, Kori. But I do think it's interesting, and also to Isabella's point about there hasn't quite been enough of this discussion about equipping democracies for climate change. And even in the democracy world, like it's a very sort of new and scary subject that people haven't really addressed, but it is being used. Going back to the ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, we are tracking how, again, it is being used as a sort of power play where China has, for example, put forward messages that, you know, we can have a 30-year plan. Yeah. There's no turnover. We can put these things into place. You guys are messy. One minute you have, you know, a democratic administration that's favorable to some efforts to combat this problem. And then in 4 years, you're going to have an administration that believes it's a hoax. So that narrative is also getting pushed. Again, the whole like democracies are too messy and difficult to actually have a real strategy to address climate. And I think that is going to be the challenge going forward. And in fact, when we were holding these big Defend Democracy workshops among democracy promotion organizations in my previous life, this was the, you know, number one priority issue is how we're going to equip legislatures, how we're going to help political parties, how we're going to, you know, deal with this issue. So I think that's going to be definitely the challenge going forward. It was funny because on your last point, because you said we haven't discussed defense and security, and I don't want to get too far in the next agenda, but on the Afghanistan issue, I mean, we were just looking through our press, our Hamilton dashboard, and we're looking at how this issue is definitely being picked up as well. And so, for example, Iranian press and government accounts mocked US withdrawal from Afghanistan, calling the mission a failure based on 20 years of lies. And Russian state media is calling, you know, the West's legacy in Afghanistan sordid and cruel. There's a lot of irony there. And other posts trying to sort of frame Iran as a responsible actor and regional peacemaker, you know, while Foreign Minister Zarif is telling an Afghan delegation in Tehran that included Taliban representatives to seize the day. So I think we are going to see not only just repercussions with regard to Afghanistan itself, and I want to raise this issue of gender because I think we, you know, need to stand by for a big impact on the lives of women, but also how it's going to play out with regard to these broader power dynamics and narratives that we're seeing from different states and how we're going to respond and preempt that. On cyber, actually, this is something that we are looking at a lot at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and we've done a lot of, there's a great, if you want to check it out, we've been doing some analysis of the recent ransomware attacks and what Biden's approach should be in addressing some of that. But also we've been trying to look at how to prepare elections from potential, how do we train and work with, for example, election officials and election management bodies to ensure that, you know, one of our biggest deliverance vehicles for democracy isn't also affected. And a lot of the countries around the world that I've worked in, this is just not something that there's preparedness around. So we have very, very vulnerable election security with regard to cyber attacks. And just one final point on that is that then this feeds in to the potential for the big lies. So, you know, if you have even the slightest doubt, even if it didn't turn out to be the case, it's super easy to sell a message about, you know, well, someone might have hacked into the voter rolls, or what about these electronic poll books? And we've written a piece on this as well. That's vulnerable, and that could have been manipulated by country XYZ. So I think that's just to put an elections angle on it, because I can't help myself. I think that's something that we need to be mindful of, and also in our efforts and democracy assistance efforts, this should be a big priority. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laura. But I think it's really interesting you brought this up in connection to Oliver's previous point about a potential January 6th in Brazil and how the information space would manipulate that would be extremely interesting. But I also really take the point you made about Afghanistan, if one is to expand it, but rather to think about what is the impact of a perception of an incapacity or failure of the West, the US, the EU to succeed in these security situations, or to even be involved, as we saw the discourse on the Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, or situation in Libya or the Syria. So what do these narratives about democracies failing to promote democracy or to resolve conflicts mean about these discourses, competing discourses about systems, authoritarian and democratic? Really interesting. Okay, Oliver, I will turn to you to address cyber and the more controversial, I think, for Brazil issue of climate, and how does this play into Brazil's international relations? And any other point you'd like to address? This is the last round of comments.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Just 3 points. The first is on, and this will then lead into climate change and cyber. I think that based on this consensus, and again, saying this from a Latin American perspective, we are about to, or we have been witnessing for the past years, the worst crisis of regional cooperation in decades. And that will make it tremendously difficult to contain the damage of people like Keiko Fujimori not recognizing or not conceding defeat, of Daniel Ortega imprisoning a ridiculous amount of opposition figures, of all the kinds of erosion of erosion of democracy type situations we're seeing in Latin America, where at best the regional reaction is neutral, and at worst it's actually negative, because, and that we've seen that during the protest movements in Chile. I mean, Chile faced a profound constitutional political crisis, and those on the, several people said, this is Venezuela's or Cuba's long arm destabilizing Chile. Then in Bolivia, the left said, this is the United States overthrowing Morales. I mean, this is the worst a region can do. Basically, rather than putting out the fires, throwing fuel on them. And if you ask me today, if there was to be a January 6th scenario in Brazil, and again, this is not something I fear, this is what I hope for, right? So I cannot imagine a better scenario in Brazil today, a better scenario which would be, the president loses and concedes. I mean, very basic and simple. Basically, nobody expects that. So we're really heading towards a very, very difficult situation. What is the region going to do? I don't think much. And that's always a problem, because you do have, even Biden administration and the EU sort of trying to do something. I mean, if you don't have regional engagement, it always becomes very, very difficult, and that will make all kinds of sort of projects to jointly address crises, I think, more difficult. And people like Keiko Fujimori get that. There's really, I mean, what kind of price is Ortega paying in the region, right? I mean, I was in Nicaragua in 2017, and people were literally, I mean, nobody would speak on the record. Everybody said, are you aware that you most probably being followed by government people? I mean, people described exactly what's happening today in detail. So there was no surprise. And basically the regional reaction was pretty much silence. I mean, some condemnation, but not really sort of more active policies against that. Now, how is that connected to climate change? I do think that in one sense, the fight against climate change can actually promote democracy, because as we're seeing right now in Brazil, when, for example, Brazil refused to maintain the Amazon Fund because the Brazilian government doesn't like civil society. And civil society was, that was a requirement by the Norwegian and German government. And when the Brazilian government said, we no longer want civil society to be on the board that decides how that money is being spent, it was suspended. So I think that that is crucial in a sense, that the combat against climate change, deforestation, etc., must involve subnational government, civil society, etc. And those are the bastions of resistance many times in countries like Brazil, which are facing threats against its democracy. At the same time, the climate crisis is a boon to populists who want to stoke nationalist fear. And for Bolsonaro, I would even say, bottom line, I think the climate emergency and the international outrage has probably, electorally speaking, been positive, because it allows him to say these guys are actually not really interested in climate. They want to occupy the Amazon. They want to do this or that. And then people making these well-intentioned but ultimately very ambiguous claims about how the Amazon should be international territory, that plays into the hand of these nationalists who question the whole climate change agenda and seek to strengthen nationalism. And I think that's something that must always be kept in mind when international policymakers speak about these issues in countries like Brazil. And finally, the cyber issue, I think that that will dominate, in all our colleagues, even those who don't study this, are beginning to sort of say, I will have to read up on this because this will be so essential for, global politics over the next years. There's no way to not actually deal with this. And it has been the dominant issue that I would say is, the Brazilian government is struggling with right now. And interestingly enough, one of the key challenges the government has faced is how to deal with the Huawei 5G issue. And the Brazilian government had a great idea and said, we'll make sure that both Beijing and Washington are happy. We will allow Huawei to join our public network, but we'll have a private government network, 5G. And for that, we will ban Huawei. And then currently, just last week, the Minister of Communications of Brazil was in Washington to discuss the future of this network. And he was told, well, actually, I don't think, he was told that Washington will not be happy with this compromise, and that there continues to be pressure to reduce the role of Huawei altogether in the public 5G network as well. And to my sense, that's something which, unfortunately, or perhaps unexpectedly, will contaminate everything. And in that sense, I think it will have a massive impact on things that go much beyond cyber. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I really enjoyed your last comments. Super interesting. I think they're a good way to lead into tomorrow's discussion on security, defense, and other issues. I have to say you're very lucky, because had we had time, I would have asked you to tell us about the Brazilian elections and to speculate on the outcome, since we've already had the midterms analysis. But you're lucky because we don't have any more time. So having said that, I want to really thank the excellent speakers. It's been really a pleasure and a learning experience to moderate this panel. I want to thank GMF and the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute for inviting me to moderate it. And with that, to give the floor back to Ian or Sergio, because I think there is some housekeeping to be done about tomorrow.
Well, I just want to say that you have moderated the panel superbly, Elena. So thank you so much. And Ian, the floor is yours. And actually, I have to quit in a minute.
Okay, I'm going to take 30 seconds or 10 seconds maybe to say the same thing, which is to thank you, Elena, to thank everyone, the speakers, the conversation. It was really terrific and exactly what we would have hoped for, just super, and leads very nicely into what we're going to talk about tomorrow, which isn't just about defense, but it'll include that and is looking more closely at some of the issues we already started to talk about in terms of great power competition and what it means for the rest of the world. So please do join us for that. Same time, same place, I think is the way to put it. But again, Elena, thank you so much for moderating this. Sergio, thanks again to you and all the friends and colleagues at the foundation. And thanks all for joining us. Tune in again tomorrow, please. We have great people and a great conversation again. So all the best.
And thank you for all the panelists, Oliver, Laura, and Kori.